In the aftermath of this year's election, there's been a lot of discussion from both sides of politics about how the system could be reviewed or changed to make things more fair. On the right side of politics, there have been some voices aligned with the Liberal Party who have been saying that preferential voting is something that needs to go, that it is a terrible idea that is disadvantaging them specifically. That's ludicrous. I'll get into that later. But that's mainly because the Liberal Party has been disadvantaged by how much preference flows are going to the Labour Party now and disadvantaging Liberals who may be coming first on first preferences but then losing out later on. But the other side of things is that there's been some left-wing criticism, particularly from people who would maybe support the Greens or are just broadly to the left of Labour. And that is the idea that Australia's lower house, the House of Representatives, should employ a system of proportional representation. And I can't stress enough how I personally, even though I'm left-wing, I do not think that that is a good idea. Now, look, this is purely my opinion, but I don't think Australia needs proportional representation, or rather, I don't think it needs it any more than it already has it. Australia has a fascinatingly weird, unique system of government when it comes to elections particularly. For those of you who aren't aware, we have instant runoff preferential voting in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, which is the house where government is formed. And then we have the upper house, the Senate, which uses a semi-proportional system to elect its members. And I feel like a lot of people think that that is somehow unfair, that it is not the House of Government, but rather the House of Review that has a proportional system. But I think there are a couple of reasons why that is a good system to have and why we shouldn't rush to change it. Now, the first point you've probably heard a lot when it comes to discussing proportional representation, the reasons for and against it. I think when it comes to the house where you form government, a key consideration should be the stability of that chamber and the stability of forming a majority government. And this is one of the most common arguments you'll see against systems like this. In a truly proportional chamber where you're forming government, it's next to impossible for any political party to manage its own majority, and what you get a lot of the time are very weird, very broad coalitions, which just inherently are not stable. You've seen that in places like the Netherlands, occasionally in Germany, and my God, Israel. These places where governments can form for periods of 18 months to 2 years before one party gets upset, it collapses, and then it's right back to the polls. And I think that stability is important. I think the first reason, which is not particularly political, but more just cultural, is that people don't like the idea of going to the polls every 18 months to 2 years. And I think that is certainly true of Australians. And don't think that coalition governments in proportional systems wouldn't constantly collapse here as they do overseas. I mean, just look at Tasmania, for example. It is the only state in the country where they have a proportional system in the chamber where they form government. And in 2025, they're going to their fourth election in 7 years. The Tasmanian election being held this year is specifically because the government could not maintain its majority working with the crossbench down there. And this is less than 18 months after their last election back in 2024. Could you imagine that at a federal level? If over the last 7 years we had had 4 elections. Imagine if we had an election in 2018, 2020, 2023, and 2025. I love elections. They're incredibly interesting and a passion point for me, but even I would get exhausted at that point. Now, aside from the idea of constant government collapse akin to what happens in Europe and even in Tasmania, is that I think adopting proportional representation to the House of Representatives is attempting to solve a problem that we don't really have. Look, I know a lot of people are frustrated that it is the upper house and not the lower house, but the Senate uses proportional representation. It is flawed, yes. Tasmania has as many representatives in the Senate as Queensland does, despite having nowhere near the same population. But the Senate, for all intents and purposes, in terms of how it practically functions at the moment, is basically a chamber to better represent the Australian people broadly and more proportionally. And look, you might say, no, look at the Constitution, like it's specifically laid out. The Senate is made to represent the states in Parliament. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, people in the Senate do not vote based on their state's interests. People in the Senate vote based on what their party wants, the party that put them on the ticket. That is why when you look at the Senate, people are sitting on the basis of party, not on the basis of state. Because, look, and I'll say it again, the Senate, realistically, in the way that it actually functions, is a second chamber specifically for party representation. And look, this idea of like party representation gets into another concern that I have, and please feel free to disagree with any of this in the comments, by the way. But one concern I have is that I'm particularly concerned about the incentive system when it comes to politicians that effectively operate without a constituency. You see this in the Senate today, particularly with senators that represent the major parties, and that is that their key consideration when it comes to their job is maintaining a good relationship with the party or factions within the party. That's why, at least in my opinion, looking at it, senators tend to be really fucking weird. This is something I've noticed a little bit more on the Liberal side than the Labor side, but if you go through like the list of Liberal and National senators, you'll realize there are a lot of factional hacks there who have gotten there specifically because they maintain a good relationship with powerful people inside their parties, and they don't really have to care about anything else. If you are a member of the lower house, you have a massive interest in maintaining a good relationship with your local constituents, representing that community, and not pissing them off. Whereas on the complete other end of the spectrum, senators tend to have an incentive to do whatever the hell they want as long as they don't piss off the party and somehow get demoted to a position that's unelectable. But I do want to say something to the merits of proportional systems, and that is that broad groups of people, and not necessarily specific local communities, do deserve a voice and do deserve representation. So as much as I might not like One Nation, that's why One Nation and the Greens, the biggest examples, deserve their seats in the Senate and why they are so important. Because groups like that, who are maybe a little bit more fringe and don't represent like a broad mainstream of Australian society, I don't think they should have a role in forming government, but they absolutely deserve a right to review the government's legislation and have the final say as to whether or not it passes, because they are representing the voices of broad groups of people, and that is good democracy. So that's why I think the lower house should remain a place where majority governments can be formed by a single party or a simple coalition. But I will say, part of what makes it justifiable in our system, unlike the nightmare situation in the United Kingdom, is that we use preferential voting. And this is why I think that the two-party preferred vote is so beautiful and so important in Australian democracy. Because in a system like the UK, where they have first past the post voting, and the UK Labour Party is able to form a majority government with 30% of the vote, I would go so far as to say that is democratically illegitimate. 70% of people did not vote for them, and we don't know what the case would have been if it was just the Tories in the UK versus the Labour Party. But here in Australia, we actually answer that question. Because yes, the Labour Party here in Australia, in this year's election, formed a massive majority government with only about a third of the vote, just like in the UK. But key consideration here is that we have proven, we have objective evidence and results here that show that the people of Australia, when looking at the two possible options for forming a majority government, the Labour Party and the Coalition, pick and prefer the Labour Party by an enormous margin. So look, this might be my bias of loving the country that I live in, but I think Australia really does have the best of both worlds in this situation. We have a lower house where stable majority governments can be formed without too much difficulty, barring some occasional hung parliaments, but then that government is also bound by the decisions of a second chamber when it comes to legislation, a second chamber which is elected through a form of proportional representation. So essentially, in a very, very long-winded way, this video is me trying as best I can to get the point across to any of my Australian viewers. I think we've got it pretty good. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was just a little opinion piece rant that I wanted to get out of my head. And look, I probably should have looked a lot more into that, but no, it was something that I wanted to share with you guys because I do genuinely appreciate your feedback here. Because from what I've seen, a lot of you are incredibly well informed on Australian politics and politics more broadly across the world. So I absolutely appreciate your input. So if you guys disagree with whatever I've said here, absolutely fine. If anything, it makes me happy. I would love to see your takes on how the system in Australia does work, how it could work differently, should it work differently. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to it. I cannot wait to hear what I assume will be hundreds of different perspectives on this issue. And thank you, as always, for making it to the end of the video. I'll see you guys again soon.